Welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 54 of ASP.NET Gridview tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about implementing custom paging in a gridview control that does not use any data source controls. We'll be using table.tblEmployee for this demo. Now, if we have to implement custom paging in a gridview control, the first step is to implement a stored procedure that can return us the required data. For example, when I am on page 1 of gridview control and if the page size is set to 3, then I need the first set of 3 records from the underlying database table. When I am on the second page, then I need the second set of 3 records. So if we have to have a stored procedure that can do this, then we need to provide the stored procedure at least with 2 input parameters. Okay, the page that you are on, that's the page index, and how many rows do you need to display on that page? That's the page size. I have the stored procedure already implemented. Okay, now if you look at the stored procedure, sp get employees by page index and page size. So you give it the page index and page size, the stored procedure is going to return the correct set of records. So here we have the 2 input parameters, page index and page size. Now there is also another parameter, total rows, which is an output parameter. So what is this parameter for? It's going to return me the total number of rows that are present in tblEmployee. Now you might be wondering, why do we need the total number of rows in the table? That's because if the gridview control has to compute the number of page numbers that it has to display within this paging area, which the users can use to page through the gridview control, then the gridview control need to know how many total rows are there. For example, if there are a total of 8 records, if you look at this tblEmployee table, it has got 8 records. So if I have 8 records within that database table, then we need to display 3 page numbers here. So how can I tell that? Unless and until I don't have this total number of rows, the gridview control cannot determine that. That's the reason why we have a third parameter, which is an output parameter, which is going to return the total number of rows in this table tblEmployee. First, let's actually test this stored procedure, and then we'll go over the code. Now the stored procedure has an output parameter and it's of type integer, so we need a variable of type integer. So first let's declare a variable of type integer, declare, and let's call this row count, and this is going to be of type integer. Now we want to execute the stored procedure. So execute, what is the name of the stored procedure? sp get employees by page index and page size. And then obviously this stored procedure has 3 parameters. The first one is the page index. Now the page index is going to be 0 because remember gridview page index is 0 based, meaning when I am on the first page of the gridview control, the page index is actually 0. When I'm on the second page, it's 1, so it's 0 index based. So page index is 0 and the page size is 3. So the second parameter is going to be 3, and the third parameter is the output parameter, which is going to receive the total number of rows, and I have a variable to receive that value, so I'm going to pass that here, and since it's an output parameter, use the out keyword, and then finally select the value that's present in that variable. Alright, let's execute this. So obviously when I'm on the first page, I should get the first set of 3 records. Look at that, I get 1, 2, 3, and then the total number of rows are 8. Now when I'm on the second page, the page index is going to be 1. So at this point, I should get 4, 5, 6 records. So 4, 5, 6, total rows is 8. And then when I'm on the third page, the page index is going to be 2. And then when we execute this, remember this table has got only 8 employees. So the third page will only return 2 records, and again the total rows is 8. Okay, so we have the stored procedure. Now let's look at the implementation of the stored procedure. We'll come back to these 4 lines in just a bit, but then look at this inner query that I have here. Let me actually execute this query and look at the output first. So look at the output. What am I getting here? I'm getting employee ID, name, gender, and city columns. These are the columns that are present in table tblEmployee. I'm getting them as it is. Along with them, I'm getting another additional column, row number. Okay, and this is a sequential row number from 1 to 8. You might be wondering, why I have this row number, because I'm going to use this to filter the correct rows that I need. Okay, we can't use employee ID because if I delete an employee record, there may be gaps in employee ID. That's why we are using this row number. So this inner query is going to return this set of data, and we are giving it an alias name here, employees. So this entire thing is going to act as a derived table. And from this table, look at what we are retrieving. We are just retrieving employee ID, name, gender, and city columns from this table employees. That's the derived table. And then we are using the filter, your row number here. So where row number is greater than or equal to, it's going to be actually at start row index, and row number is less than or equal to at end row index. Okay, now let's understand what are these start row index and end row indexes. Okay, so basically when I'm on the first page, the start row index should be, because if you look at this output, when I'm on the first page, the start row index should be 1, end row index should be 3. When I'm on the second page, start row index should be 4, end row index should be 6. When I'm on the third page, start row index should be 7, end row index should be 9. But since I only have 8 records, I will get 7 and 8. Now let's see how we are computing the start and end row indexes. Okay, now these are the two declarations for those variables, start row index and end row index of type integer. And look at start row index, how we are computing it. Start row index is equal to page index into page size. So when I am on the page of 1 of the grid view control, what is page index? It's 0. So 0 into 3 is going to be 0. 0 plus 1 is 1. So start row index is going to be 1. And how are we computing end row index? Page index plus 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. Into 3 is 3. So end row index is going to be 3. Obviously now when we execute this, we should get records 1 to 3. Okay, similarly, if you pass the right page index and the page size, you're going to get the correct set of records. So very simple, straightforward query here. And then the final statement here is to compute the total number of rows. Remember, this is an output parameter, and we are retrieving the total number of rows from TBLEmployee and storing that in that parameter. And that parameter will be returned to whoever is going to call that stored procedure. So we have the required stored procedure. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's add EmployeeDataAccessLayer class file, and let's call this EmployeeDataAccessLayer.cs. Now, to encapsulate the employee information that's present in this table TBLEmployee, we need an employee class. I have that already implemented here. It's a very straightforward class with 4 auto-implemented properties: employee ID, name, gender, and city, as you can see here. Alright, now within the employee data access layer class itself, we need a method which can execute the stored procedure that we have just written and obviously retrieve the data. And to do that, we need to write ADO.NET code. So I have to import some required ADO.NET namespaces: system.data, system.data.sql client, and system.configuration. Now let me copy and paste this method, and then we'll go over the code. Now again, this is going to be a straightforward ADO.NET code. Remember that the stored procedure has got an output parameter as well. Okay, so now the stored procedure has got an output parameter, so at total rows, and then 2 input parameters, page index and page size. So if you look at my method, get employees, it also has got those 2 input parameters, page index and page size, and the output parameter, total rows. We will pass these method parameters as values to the respective SQL parameters. And look at the return type of the method. It's going to return a list of employee objects. And this output parameter of this method is going to return the total number of rows. And the grid view control can do its job. Okay, so we have here a variable of type list employee, and then using the configuration manager class, we are reading the connection string from web.config file. We are building the SQL connection object using the connection string. And notice the SQL command, it's nothing but the stored procedure sp get employees by page index and page size. And then since it's a stored procedure, we are specifying the command type as stored procedure. And then notice this, we are creating a SQL parameter object here, and the parameter name is at page index. That's the first parameter of this stored procedure. And the parameter value is going to be the input parameter that's coming into this method, page index. And then we are adding that parameter object to the parameters collection property of the command object. And we are doing the same thing for page size parameter. And look at this, the third parameter that this stored procedure expects is an output parameter. So obviously here we are creating a SQL parameter object, and then we are specifying the parameter name, And since it's an output parameter, we need to specify the direction as output and the data type. This output parameter is of type integer. And then obviously we are adding that output parameter to the parameters collection property of this command object. And then we are opening the command, connection, executing the command, and then obviously it is going to return some rows. So we are looping through each row and converting that into an employee object, populating the employee object properties, and then we are adding that employee object to the list. And then look at this, after we've done looping through each row, when we get out of this while loop, we are closing that reader. Now it's very important to close this reader before we actually retrieve the output parameter value. So what is this at total rows? This is nothing but the output parameter name. So from the command object parameters collection property, we are passing in the name of the parameter, and then we are retrieving the value out of it. Okay, now when you retrieve the value before you close the reader, the output parameter value will be null. So that's why it's very important you close the reader before you actually try to retrieve the output parameter value. And then obviously we are returning the list back. Okay, so that's our employee data access layer. Pretty straightforward. So far we have implemented the stored procedure, and we have implemented this employee data access layer, which is going to invoke that stored procedure. Now let's flip to web form, and let's drag and drop a grid view control, and let's auto format this. Let's choose brown sugar scheme. Let's enable paging by setting allow paging property to true, and then let's set the page size to 3. Okay, so we have the grid view control here. Now for the grid view control, now if we have to implement custom paging in a grid view control, to display these page numbers, okay, we have to use a repeater control. There are several ways to implement custom paging in a grid view control. The easiest way I can think of is using a repeater control basically to display those page numbers. Because remember, this employee data access layer is going to return just 3 records, okay, to this grid view control, because we only get the required number of rows. And then we are going to use a repeater control to display the page numbers. So let me drag and drop a repeater control, and then within the repeater control I'm going to use an item template, and then I'm going to specify a link button as the interface that can be used for paging. So let me drag and drop a link button. Okay, we'll configure the properties of this link button in just a bit, but now let's flip to the design mode. So this repeater is going to act as the paging bar for the grid view control, so that the user can click on them and page through the grid view control. Alright, now within the code behind of this web form 1, the first thing that I'm going to do is to implement a private method. First let me copy and paste this private method, and then we'll go over the code. So what is this private method doing? Now first thing, let's get rid of this compilation error here. Now when we dragged and dropped the repeater on the web form, the ID is repeater1. Let me change that ID to something called repeater paging. Alright, so that should get rid of that error. Now basically, why are we using this repeater? This repeater is going to display the page numbers beneath the grid view control. Now how many pages can it display? How many page numbers does this repeater need to display? How will it know that? Okay, so to compute that, we need to specify the page size and the page number, and that's what we are passing into this repeater. So I have the page size and the total number of rows that are available in the table. So if I have a total of 8 rows, and if the page size is 3, then we know we need 3 pages for the grid view control. Okay, so that's why we have these 2 parameters here, and there is a third parameter, page index. In a bit we'll understand why we need this input parameter for this method. Okay, so basically here we are computing the total pages that are required, and how are we doing that? Total rows divided by the page size. So total rows, for example, if it's 8 and the page size is 3, 8 by 3, the quotient is going to be 2. So total pages is 2, but then there are 2 more records left out. 2 into 3 is 6 records, but where should I display the rest of the 2 records if my page size is 2. That's why what am I doing here? I am using this mod operator. So total rows mod page size. If that is not equal to 0, in our case it's not equal to 0, it's 2, the remainder is 2, which means to the total pages we need to add 1. So we need a total of 3 pages. So we are incrementing total pages by 1. And then what are we doing here? We are creating an object of type list of list item. So a list of list item objects. And remember, what is a list item object? A list item, basically contains 3 properties. It contains text, value, and enabled property, which is actually very useful to us because we are going to use those properties and modify this link button control as we need it. Okay, so basically we are creating an object here of type list of list item, and then if total pages is greater than 1, so if the total pages is greater than 1, only then we need to show these paging buttons. If I only have 3 records in my database table tblEmployee, then we don't have to show any paging buttons here because all the records are shown. So if the total pages is greater than 1, then what we are doing, we are using this for loop here for int I is equal to 1, I less than or equal to total pages. So in our case the total pages is going to be 3. So I is equal to 1, I less than or equal to 3, I plus plus. So we are incrementing the I value, and then what we are doing to the pages object here, we are adding a new list item object, because what is pages? It's a list of list item object. So we are adding a new list item object, and look at this list item object constructor. We are using a constructor that is taking in 3 parameters, the text, value, and enabled parameters. So text is string, value is string, so I is here an integer. So first time I will be 1, so 1, the text will be 1 and value will also be 1, but they are the string representations because we are converting it to a string. And then finally here, look at this, the third parameter for this constructor is a boolean parameter, and it's true or false. Okay, so we are saying I not equal to page index plus 1. Now why do we need this property? Because we are going to use this boolean property of this list item object to determine whether if the link button should be enabled or disabled in the paging bar. For example, when I'm on the first page of the grid view control, this link button should not be clickable. I should not enable that because I'm already on the page, on the first page. So there should be no reason why the user should click and post the web form once again. Okay, so to determine that, I'm going to use this boolean property. Okay, look at this. When I'm on the first page, page index, remember, grid view page index is 0 based. So page index is going to be 0. If it's going to be 0, I'm actually on page 1. And then look at this, the page numbers start from 1. So that's why I'm saying increment page index by 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 not equal to 1. Okay, that's going to be false. And then we will use this property, the parameter, basically to initialize the enabled property of the link button, which we will use within the repeater control for paging. Okay, if that does not make sense at this time, don't worry, it'll be much clearer when we actually use this method in a bit. Okay, so we are populating this list item object with 3 parameters: the text, value, and whether if it's enabled or not. Okay, and then what we are doing, look at this, this is very important. We are setting the pages, which is nothing but a list of list item objects, as the data source for our repeater control. Usually, for example, if I want to bind customers to a grid view control, we will say gridview1.dataSource is equal to list of customer objects. Here we are giving the data source as list of list item objects, and if you look at this list item object, it has got text, value, and enabled properties, which we are going to use to customize the link button that we display within the repeater control for paging purpose. Okay, so that's our private method. Okay, now let's actually configure the link button, set all the required properties of this link button. So the ID for this one, I will just call this link button. Okay, runit is equal to server, and then I'm going to get rid of this text right here, and then I'm going to set the text property. And just to speed things up, I have that already typed as well. So let me copy and paste these properties right here. So what are we doing? Let me format this by pressing Ctrl K and D. So we are setting the text property. So we are setting the text property of the link button to the text property of the list item object, because what is the data source for this repeater? Pages. And what is pages? It's a list of list item objects. So the list item object has got a property called text, which we are setting as the text property of this link button. So number 1, 2 and 3 will be displayed within that link button. And command argument, we are setting that to value property. You can either also use text here, because if you remember, within this function both text and value are set to the value of I. I is what? 1, 2 or 3, the number. So the command argument is tied with value property. Again, it's going to be 1, 2 or 3. In a bit you will see how we are going to use this command argument property. And look at this. This is what is important. Enabled is set to the enabled property of the list item object. And remember, this enabled, when I am on the first page, this enabled property, this expression is going to return false, because I is 1 and 1 not equal to, when I'm on the first page, page index will be 0. 0 plus 1 is 1. So 1 not equal to 1. What does this expression return? It's going to return false. So, and then we are setting that as the value for this enabled property of the link button. So when I am on page 1, enabled is false, meaning that link button will be disabled and the users will not be able to click on that when I am on first page. Okay? Alright, so that's it. We are done with this, repeater, configuring the buttons that we need for paging. And then the next thing is, obviously, within the page load event, if it's not a post back, we need to invoke the employee data access layers get employees method. And then look at that. First of all, I am creating a variable of type integer called total rows, because why? This get employees method, notice this, what are the parameters of this method? The page index. So how do I get to know on which page we are there? We are basically using gridview page index, but remember, if it is the initial get request of the web form, we are loading the web form for the first time, in which case the page index will be 0. I can simply pass in 0 there if I want. And then the next parameter for this method is the page size. So what is the page size? That's configured at the grid view level. So instead of hard coding it to 3, I'm using the page size property of the grid view control. So if I set it to 5, then it's going to display 5 rows. So we are using the page size property of the grid view control. And then finally the output parameter total rows. So I've created a variable here, total rows, which is going to receive the total number of rows. Remember, within the employee data access layer, this total rows is going to return the total number of rows that are present in TBL employee table. Okay, and then we are setting what is this method returning? It's returning list of employees, which is set as the data source for the grid view control, and we are invoking the data bind. And then look at this, we are invoking this private method data bind repeater. Okay, and obviously this repeater also requires the page index, the page size, and total rows. Okay, so the page index, you can hard code that to 0. Alright, so that's done now. And the last thing that is basically left is when I click this link button. Look at this at this point of time. Let's actually run this and see if it's going to work. Obviously when the grid view control first renders, it should only display the first set of 3 records. And look at this, I have the page numbers here. Now when I click on page, see, I'm on page 1 and this page now is not clickable. Now when I click on page 2, look at this, basically nothing happens. Why? Because we have not written code to respond to the click event of these link buttons that are displayed within the repeater. So now let's go ahead and add a click event handler for that link buttons. So on click, so we need to define an event handler method within the code behind file. So the name of the button is link button. So let me copy that, go to the code behind file, and then let's add a event handler method. So it's going to be protected, it's not going to return anything. Link button underscore click, that's going to be the name of the method, and the first parameter is going to be object sender, and then the second parameter is going to be event argument C. Now, if it is difficult for you to remember the syntax of the event handler method, the easiest way is obviously, you have link button, with ID. So if you look at the ID of the link button, it's link button. So if it's hard for you to remember the syntax of the event handler method, you can simply say link button. Actually, let's do it somewhere inside, otherwise we won't get IntelliSense. So link button dot click. Let's actually, now since that link button is within the repeater control, we don't get IntelliSense. So the easiest way is obviously I can create an object of type link button, and then we can say lb dot click plus equals, look at that, when I press tab here, it's automatically going to generate the event handler method for me with the parameters, name of the method, and the return type. So you can either do this as well if it's hard for you to remember the syntax of the event handler method for a click event of a button. And I'm going to call this link button. Let's give us a meaningful name. Alright, now I'm going to specify this as the method to invoke on click of this link button. Okay, let's go to the web form and let's actually get rid of this code here because we don't need this. Alright, so now all that is left out is to implement this link button. So what should happen when we click on that link button? We should change the page index of the grid view control and then repopulate the grid view control with required data and then also bind the repeater, and that's what exactly we are doing here. So that's the method. So let's copy that and paste it within our event handler method. So basically, again, we are creating a variable of type integer called total rows and initializing that to 0. And look at this. We are retrieving the command argument. You remember when we were configuring this link button, we have set the command argument to the value property of the list item object. Okay, so which is going to be 1, 2, or 3. And remember, within that private method, the page numbers start at 1. Okay, so the command argument, we are retrieving the command argument of that link button. So our sender, who raised this event, the link button that's present within the repeater control. So we know that sender is a link button, so we are typecasting that to be of type link button, and we are retrieving the command argument property, which is going to be 1, 2, or 3 depending on the link button that you have clicked, and we are converting that command argument to integer and storing it in this variable. And remember, the page numbers start at 1, whereas the page index of the grid view control is 0. Okay, so if I am on page 1, then the page index is actually 0. So here we have to decrement the page index by 1, otherwise we won't get the correct page number. So page index is equal to page index minus 1. And then what we are doing, we are setting the page index of the grid view control, and then we are passing that page index, page size, and the output parameter total rows to our getEmployees method of data access layer, setting that as the data source, invoking the data bind, and then invoking data bind repeater method as well, passing in the required parameters. That's it. So let's run this now and see if it's going to work as expected. So we are on page 1. It's showing the first set of 3 records. I click on page 2. Look at that, 4, 5, 6 are displayed. And look at this, 2 is disabled but 1 and 3 are enabled. I click on page number 3. We have only 2 records. Alright. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.